And welcome back to the Immigration Ain't Easy podcast. This is Mo Goldman with my professional podcasting voice. And actually, I do sound like this most of the time, anyways. I am extremely honored to have Aly Wane on with me. I was just, before we went live, talking with Aly about the fact that we have interesting connections. I went to Syracuse University. He attended Lemoyne, which is right in that same area in Onondaga. Is it Onondaga County?
It's Onondaga County, yeah.
Yeah, and it's in central New York, CNY. And I was introduced to Aly through a mutual Facebook friend, and it really goes to the power of social media, which has some, positive, obvious, and negative attributes to it. But one of the more positive attributes is that it brings people together from different walks of life, different, regions of the world or country, and can bring our voices together. And I remember it was about a little over a decade ago that a mutual friend of ours, Richard Hartwell, who has a dear friend who has passed, he had contacted me and said, "Hey, I've got this Senegalese man who is looking for some options on how to figure out, his immigration situation." And Richard kind of ran this like little underground railroad, so to speak, where he would, reach out to me with like this whole, list of the facts. And then I'd come back and be like, maybe it can be, workable, or most of the time there wasn't much I could do, unfortunately, because of the stringency of our immigration laws. So I then started, reading up and I found more information about Aly. And at the time, it was right around the time that Aly had come out as being undocumented in this country, and he did it at a church. And I have appreciated what you do as somebody who, is living in this, kind of draconian, Kafkaesque, like just nightmarish situation. And we're going to talk about that. But just to give you a little bit of background about Aly, he is a human rights organizer. He's based, like I said, in Syracuse, New York. He's originally from Senegal. His primary focuses are on anti-war, economic justice, racial and immigrant justice. He's currently on the advisory board of Freedom University in Georgia, which we'll talk a little bit about, and also on the advisory board of the Immigration Justice Network. He has also served on the steering committee of the Syracuse Peace Council, which is the oldest local autonomous grassroots peace and justice, social justice organization in the United States. We think sometime in the mid to late 1930s is when it was founded. And that Peace Council, the Syracuse Peace Council, their mission is to educate, agitate, and organize for a world where war, violence, and exploitation in any form will no longer exist. Good luck with that. But hey, it's a good premise. And he's been involved with a lot of other organizations, especially around, Black undocumented immigrants and Black immigration networks and so forth. So thank you for joining me, Aly.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have this conversation. I certainly want to extend my own appreciation to you in terms of not just being an immigration lawyer, but an immigration lawyer who's an ally to the movement. I was pretty naive when I first started doing this work, and I didn't realize that there was a whole section of immigration lawyers who basically took advantage of how miserable the situation is, and who sometimes, take the money from people without actually doing the work. And one of the things that I've loved about being involved in the movement is meeting people like yourself who really kind of give the lie to that negative stereotype and who often go above and beyond what they need to do to help us try to navigate what you mentioned, which is like a deeply Kafkaesque system. It's funny that you mentioned Kafkaesque specifically, because when I went to school, I was obsessed with like existentialism and I loved Kafka. And like years of doing this kind of work, I'm like, oh man, that was like my intellectual training for dealing with like just the insane bureaucracy
Insanity.
immigration
Yeah.
system. So yeah, yeah.
And so let's go back to the beginning. You were born in Senegal. And so how long did you live in Senegal?
Yeah, so I lived in Senegal only the first 7 years of my life, and bringing it to speed to now, it's like I'm 48 years old, 2025, but was born here, lived the first 7 years, and then I've basically been traveling ever since. The last time that I was on Senegalese soil was, I believe I was 10 years old, and it was just literally to visit. But I have not been back to what is technically my home country, or at least the country that I've been born, since I was 10 years old. Like a lot of folks who eventually became undocumented, I spent most of like my childhood and development years in the United States. In fact, I'm certainly one of those persons who, if I didn't tell you that I was undocumented, some folks like would not really know. And I remember when I first got involved in this situation because I lost my own status, I remember thinking to myself, oh, I'm such a unicorn of a case and I have such bad luck and everything. And the more I got involved in organizing on the issue of immigration, the more I realized, oh my God, I'm nowhere near close to how bad this gets. For example, just the fact that I came here legally, as you know, offers me at least this long potential pathway to legalizing in a way that a lot of my friends who are fully undocumented and who were brought here, quote unquote, illegally, they don't even have that. So, it's been, even as an immigrant myself, I tell people all the time, even as an immigrant and an immigrant organizer, if I didn't have this identity, I don't think I would have any sense of how brutal the regular immigration system is, because it is so complicated. And the stereotypes that people have about how easy it is to become a citizen, take a test, you pay a fee, you're good. People have no idea of like the years and years and years of processing and waiting and everything. And in fact, in my own case, this might be appropriate in terms of this particular podcast. Um, just to sort of catch you up in terms of where I am, my sister, who became a U.S. citizen through a marriage, another sort of pathway, she actually applied for me to get a green card all the way back in 2012. The application was approved in 2020, but as you know, there's a gap between the application being approved and you actually being able to access those privileges. In 2020, I was originally told I had to wait until 2023. I called in 2023. The lawyer told me that the line was all the way up to 2027. And I kid you not, just this week, my lawyer called me out of the blue and he was just like, sorry about that. It turns out the line now is up to 2029, you know? So,
Yeah, and and I just will interject that what you're referring to, and this is important. I mean, one of the things I like to do on this podcast, educate about the complexities of the system. And I always tell people, look at the visa bulletin. If you really want to know how screwed up the system is and why it's so bad, the visa bulletin is really the ultimate way to look at it. And the category you're in is called the fourth preference family-based category. And they are still working cases that were initially filed August 1st, 2007. That is the April bulletin's date for where you come from. It's called a country of chargeability, which would be Senegal. You are backlogged still, even though the petition was filed in 2012. you can't act on that petition in any way, shape, or form until that priority date finally comes current. And that chart sometimes doesn't move, it sometimes regresses. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, it's nuts, and I mean, for people who think that it's an easy process, I just figured out as soon as I got the information about how long this would last, that as of now, it looks like I'm going to wait longer after the application or the petition was approved than the entire application length process from 2012 to 2020, because that took me 8 years, and looks like now it's gonna take me 9 years to get to the point where I can access those privileges. And as you know, until then, it's not like a defense against deportation or anything. It's just like, well, you're in the
No
system, but
protection.
good luck,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's
And by the way, the petition itself, probably at the time that she filed, was about $400 to $500 as a filing fee. I mean, this is one of the few things where you pay a good amount of money and get the worst service ever. 8 years to wait for that petition to get approved, which, by the way, it wouldn't have mattered if it got approved in 2013. You're still subject to this insane backlog. But it is kind of funny when you look at, and it's not as funny as it is probably sad, when you actually look at the fact that you're paying a good amount of money, hard-earned money, to get almost nothing out of it. The government just makes so, and that's where, I think when we talk about, the fraud and, the corruption that goes on from not only immigration lawyers or lawyers who are, purporting to help people, or even notarios who are not lawyers, or document preparers, they see this as a cash cow for them because people get desperate and they'll file applications. And, if you build yourself on, being disingenuous and not having integrity, um, that it's very shameful. It is. And it doesn't reflect good on our field, obviously, just like any other, field. But it's also very sad to see, because I've had people who've come to me in situations like yours who are convinced that somehow we can magically fix things. And they hear all the time, oh yeah, there's got to be a right way and easy, just keep hearing that stuff. And I hear that from people who are like MAGA supporters, who are like, hey, I've got this guy working for me, he's the best guy in the world, I want to help this guy. And I'll be like, yeah, well, I have no way of doing it. He's like, well, if I throw a bunch of money at you, can't you do something? You're a lawyer. Nope. All right, so let's move back to Senegal. So you get out of Senegal, and then where did you go?
Let's see. So I left Senegal because my mom was looking for employment outside of Senegal. Unfortunately, my biological dad ended up passing away when I was 7. Really destabilized mom, and she felt the need to leave. And she actually went to different countries trying to find work, and she eventually landed on getting a job at the United Nations as a diplomat. And that was all the way back in 1985. And so she brought me and my sister, who's my only other sort of close relative, to the States as her dependent on a diplomatic visa. So another one of those non-immigrant visas that doesn't count towards legalization. But I've been in this country since I was about 8.5, 9 years old or so. And I've spent most of my time here. I have traveled in and out since before I lost my status, but I have spent most of my time in the United States.
So when you arrived, you had a visa. It's probably like an A or a G visa, which is the diplomat
Yeah.
visas. Did you then change to a student visa at some point, which is an F1?
Yes, exactly. I finished my high school years in DC, and so switched from my diplomatic visa to a student visa in order to finish my junior and senior year in DC. And then I did 2 years at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and I was on a student visa then and there. And that's basically when I lost my status. By the end of my sophomore year at University of Pennsylvania, basically my mom was the person who was, paying the overwhelming bulk of like the tuition. And unfortunately, around then, she just like lost a lot of money. So both my sister and I actually had to leave school because we could not afford continuing to pay for that. And so that was 96. And that's when unfortunately, my student visa lapsed. And then tragedy struck 3 years later in 1999, because that was all the way in 1996. In 1999, I heard that my mom unfortunately died. It was pretty awful. She was a victim of domestic abuse. So it was kind of a combination of obviously this immense grief and the fact that I was now in this new situation where I was fully undocumented with no financial support. And as we've established, I mean, I didn't really have like strong ties to Senegal or anything. So, like a lot of people who are immigrants, the idea of being deported to me, it wasn't just kind of like, oh, you're going to be deported back home where you have support or whatever. To me, it would have been like being deported to a completely foreign country. I mean, I still, because of social media, have some ties to folks there, but they're very distant. And so I found myself in this country, which was my adoptive country, but with no pathway to citizenship. I originally thought that maybe the H-1B skilled worker visa route might help, but by the time I finished my schooling, I basically just have an undergrad in political science, and that is not something you can sell if you're.
It's hard to find jobs and get sponsorship, which is hard for H-1Bs.
Exactly.
So where was your mother when she died?
She was in Zimbabwe actually at the time. So that's right. That's a good point. She was outside of the country. By the time she died, I unfortunately had not even seen her physically in 4 years because of all of the traveling and moving around. When I was finishing my high school years, it was at a boarding school, so I wasn't with her at that time. And then it was the 2 years at Penn. So I basically didn't get to see her those last few years. And one of the most painful things about her passing away, and unfortunately, as you know, it is an extremely common experience, is that when I heard that she died, that was like the first major painful, traumatic thing that was connected to the immigration system, which was that I could not go and pay my respects. Obviously, technically, I could leave the country, but if I left the country, I would not be able to come back in. So it's actually one of the reasons I'm fighting so hard to regularize my own situation. It's so that I can access the right to travel, which I believe I'm owed as a human being in general, the right to travel so that I can go to her home country, which is actually not Senegal, but Mali, also in West Africa, and just be able to pay my respects to her grave sites.
She buried there, yeah.
Yes, she's there.
And I think a lot of people who may not be as worldly, and not understand that in Africa, there's a lot of like transiting that goes on. Like, I'll see people who were, they were from Mali, and then next thing you know, they have kids in Togo and they have kids in Senegal. And there's like, it's interesting. You see a lot of that. It's kind of like nomadic situations. And a lot of it relates to the government in those different countries. And, for example, the Banyamulenge in DRC, and many of them end up going to Rwanda, and then they have these children who were born in Rwanda. It's interesting dynamics when you talk about migration flows, especially. But did your sister at that time, when your mother had passed, were you with your sister, or where was she located?
No, I actually didn't get to spend all that much time with my sister when I was younger, because by the end of my second year here, she's she's about 6.5 years older than I am. So by the end of my second year here, she was already college age. So she went to finish her undergrad at Allegheny College in Pennsylvania. And the only reason why she found a pathway to legalization was that around the time that we had to leave school because of lack of funding, she was going to business school at the time. And she had friends who were very close to her in business school who were just starting up a company. They figured out what was going on with Ida, that's her name, and they basically just offered her a job to give her the H-1B visa so that she could have a pathway to legalize.
And that seems to often be the biggest struggle for H-1Bs is finding a business, an entity that will be able to sponsor, because again, the barriers are, it's not only just what is your degree in finding a job in that specific field, but it's also the cost there. I mean, I don't think a lot of people understand when they say, immigrants are stealing our jobs and there's no, no oversight and so on and so forth. The regulations and oversight is beyond belief. I mean, employers have to pay, at a or at or above the specific prevailing wage, which is usually, oftentimes higher than maybe what they're even paying U.S. workers. And they have to do, certain documents and forms and so on. I put my hand up and now little bubbles are popping up around my head, by the way. It's so funny. Just nobody will ever see this, but because it's all audio, but it was just kind of weird. All of a sudden a little thumbs up came up next to my head. That was a bit distracting. But anyway, so what people don't also understand is the government filing fees are thousands of dollars per application. And then ultimately, there's a limit on the number of H-1Bs for each fiscal year, which is kind of absurd when you think about it, because think about all the money this government is just leaving on the table and how many jobs they could create just in processing these visas. So I get it. So let me ask you, at the time, going back to the time your mom passed, like, who was your support system? Like, were you alone? Did you have anyone who was there for you? I mean, it had to have been a very trying time.
It was awful.
Yeah.
It was awful because it was a combination of, I was going through this major, major grieving process. I would estimate now that I was in like major depression for like 2 years, and I did not have support. My sister, she wasn't close by, and she obviously was also someone who had to leave school, so she could not help me out financially. My mom was abroad, it was the same thing. So this is something that I've had to really think about over the years because it took me a while for me to even accept it. But around that time, I could have become formally homeless. I just did this kind of Hail Mary thing because I was completely isolated without any support. Around the time of my sophomore year, when I was going to the University of Pennsylvania, you know how schools have these like different alternative breaks, and some of them are focused on social justice outings. And that sophomore year, I had gone to this community called St. Francis Farm as part of like this Penn alternative break project that I did. And St. Francis Farm happened to be a community that is connected to this broader Catholic leftist movement called the Catholic Worker Movement. And I often tell people that even though it was tragic that I had to leave school, like I feel like a lot of my education really started at the Catholic Worker Movement because I had plenty of time to just kind of read about social justice organizing and activism and everything. And I found myself like in that community in a way that I wouldn't have had at school. But what ended up happening was basically at the end of my sophomore year, because, I was out of status, I didn't have any money. I basically just sold my remaining textbooks. I called up this community, this Catholic worker community, and I was just like, well, you guys talk about hospitality all the time. I don't have a place to stay, so like, is it cool if I just show up? And bless them, they were just like, absolutely, just come by. So I used the money, grabbed the bus ticket, and then ended up in near Pulaski, New York, in rural upstate New York. I mean, I went from like the campus of the University of Pennsylvania to like, shoveling manure on a farm in upstate New York. It was like the most humbling kind of like social class come down in a while. But I do feel retroactively grateful, not just because they received me, but because I genuinely believed. I mean, that's where I found myself as a person. I was studying international relations before then at Penn, and I hated it because, like, at that department, for example, one of the role models of the Penn International Department was Henry Kissinger.
Oh, well, there you
And
go.
I was already a little bit of like lefty peacenik. I was just like, I don't think that's what I want to do with my life. But when I was at the Catholic Worker, and as I was helping them do kind of social justice related work, I just got to read about all these different social justice movements. And that's really when a lot of my real adult education kind of life started. So just very grateful to have had that background. And to this day, I mean, I tell people that's where all this comes from, is from that grounding in these kind of basic ethical and social justice values. And I've tried to, be true to those things regardless of what this system has thrown at me and the rest of immigrants. So, yeah.
Let me ask about, for example, the question that usually would come up. Why didn't you leave the US at the time that you fell into this like undocumented situation? Like, why did you remain?
Hmm.
What was the reason for that?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I don't even think it would even have occurred to me to try to figure out to go back to Senegal at the time, because I had no ties to Senegal. I mean, I had like distant relatives. I had some folks from my biological father's side, the one who passed away when I was 7. But these are folks I hadn't seen since I was a kid. I had no ties with them whatsoever. So, as with, I think, increasingly, certainly more and more immigrants, the idea of quote unquote going back home made no sense to me, since for me, internally, home was the US. Like, I totally grew up culturally American, cable TV, MTV. I still remember begging my mom for a Nintendo Entertainment System and just feeling like that was the biggest achievement of my young life, was to convince her to get me one. So I was already basically Americanized by then. So it didn't even occur to me that that would be an option, because I didn't think of Senegal as home or a place to go back to. But I was in that existential place that I have found that so many folks are in now, which is that internally I felt like American, but the system did not offer me a pathway to make that a reality. And in some ways, I've been trying to make what is internal internal kind of external, in terms of matching the fact that, yes, by default, whether I like it or not, and I mean that seriously, whether I like it or not, I am by default American. But I also was in a country where the immigration system just got so tough that I just could not make that a reality. And like I said, I found that not only am I not an exception, but that I'm nowhere near a worst case scenario. I have friends, right now, who were brought here, quote unquote, illegally as kids, who are functionally completely American and who have no pathway whatsoever. And that really
And
radicalized
a lot of,
life for folks.
I was going to say, a lot of what's happened or what happened to you at that time was right at the time it coincided when Clinton signed the 1996 Immigration Act, which made everything a thousand times harder. with the bars and all the other, anti-immigrant restrictionist provisions that were in that law. Um, your name, Aly, is that your birth name? Aly?
It is, and for the longest time, I was curious about why it was spelled ALY as opposed to ALI. But I have found I've actually met other folks from Senegal who use that spelling now. So I don't exactly know where it comes from, but it's a little bit more common than I originally thought. So
Was there any backstory to the name, or was it just a name that your parents gave you? And
I think it's just the name that my parents gave me, although connecting this to social media and names, because of the fact that I traveled around so much, I definitely lost touch with a lot of my biological family. But when Facebook started up and, we started to use that much more sort of, in our daily lives, I remember being contacted by someone on Facebook whose last name was Wane, Wane, and who um, contacted me basically telling me, and she was just kind of like, oh, I know we're related. And I was just like, well, that's kind of nuts, like it's just a last name. But sure enough, like within a week of her connecting through me through Facebook, she was able to connect me with like my actual close biological family because the surname Wane, Wane, is actually so common, and we clearly, have been connected over the years, regardless. So it was funny because I remember kind of almost scoffing at her assertion that like, oh yeah, I know we're not like necessarily directly related, but we are related somehow. And I remember just being like, well, that's just crazy. And I kid you not, I think it was within 2 weeks, she connected me with folks from on my dad's side of the family, and I've been able to keep in touch with those folks, through social media since. So
yeah, it happened to me. There were a lot of Goldmans that suddenly started asking me to be their Facebook friends, and I was like, "Who are these people?" I mean, why all of a sudden am I getting all these Goldman, friend requests? And it turned out, my history. My dad, he had a falling out with his family, and then never remained in contact with most of them. And it was a sad, it was a real sad situation. And it also gave me a greater appreciation for family, and because I had a small very small, with my mom's side, most of them were wiped out in the Holocaust. And so there wasn't much there. Then all of a sudden I start getting all these Goldman friend requests, and I'm like, it turns out they're all my like cousins and aunts and people who I had no idea were even around, and it was kind of cool. And now I've got a great relationship with, a lot of these folks. So yeah, you and I have some weird parallels there. So you went through this kind of, it sounds like almost like a rebirth in a sense, when you went upstate and were, shoveling manure and finding your way there, maybe getting a little bit out of the doldrums of what happened. Um, in 2012, you did come out publicly and say, "Hey, I am here undocumented." What prompted that? Were you living in any sort of fear leading up to that? Like, what did you have any trepidation in doing that? Like, tell me a little bit about that story.
yeah, I mean, there was actually definitely an escalation to my being ready to come out publicly as undocumented. I mean, speaking of fear, absolutely. Like, like most undocumented folks, for the longest time, even though through the Catholic Worker, I had started doing grassroots political activism, mostly in the anti-globalization movement, in the anti-war movements. But I did not want to touch the issue of immigration. I was just like, this, it's too close to home. I didn't want anyone to find out about my status. But because I ended up in Syracuse, New York, a couple of us, it was in the mid 2000s, we started to hear stories from people in our community just getting disappeared. And because we were active on a whole host of issues, one of the activists was someone who did a lot of work in prisons and detention. And he figured out that like, oh no, these are just immigrants that are getting like picked up by Border Patrol because, as you know, within 100 miles of the border, Border Patrol has jurisdiction, and Syracuse is 100 miles from that border. So even though it's not like I kind of volunteered to just get into all of this, I just felt like once I realized what was going on, I was just like, there's no way I'm going to be on the sidelines and just not do anything. So a couple of us just got together informally. We created a small grassroots group called the Detention Task Force. And what we did was we found, individuals who had been stopped and incarcerated who were immigrants. We basically helped them gather and fundraise for bail money to get them out of detention. And then we did anti-deportation work, and like a lot of activists, when I started out doing anti-deportation work, I mean, I think I was very much like a small L liberal who believed that like, well, the system can just be reformed and it's not that bad. We just kind of have to tweak it, right? And at the time, and I really want to emphasize this for people, like we really, in terms of the cases that we picked like the quote unquote like best case scenario individuals in terms of people who had been here for many years, quote unquote, no criminal record, long family ties, sometimes with U.S. citizen children, sometimes with U.S. citizen spouses. I mean, we really thought, and I remember when we took on some of these cases, like I was still in the frame of mind of just like, well, this person clearly is an asset to the community. It would make no sense, to have that person be deported. And we didn't lose all the cases, but we lost enough of those cases that began to radicalize me. That began to get me to understand like, oh no, this is a brutal machine that I really need to understand. And I went from, this is kind of like the birth of the organizer, right? Like I went from personally feeling bad and personally feeling responsible for not having done enough to help individuals to fight their deportations, to realizing, oh no, this is a systemic issue and I need to
get angry at the system.
Yeah, I need to understand how this system works in order to be able to organize better. And it also absolutely radicalized me. I think, if you've, I often tend to trust the immigrant organizers who have done some anti-deportation work because that tends to radicalize you real quick. You go from like what the ideal of the system is supposed to be to the reality. And it's brutal. And certainly specifically as a Black immigrant organizer, and as someone who is kind of forced to think about the criminal justice system, one of my earliest interventions that I realized when I started doing organizing was that the immigrant detention system was basically just part and parcel of the broader prison industrial complex. And that if I really wanted to understand this, I couldn't just limit myself to understanding quote unquote the immigration system, but I needed to understand how and why people are criminalized, who benefits from that criminalization, and get into a conversation that is also about being in solidarity with very often, unfortunately, Black and brown U.S. citizens who are incarcerated. I realized that the same folks who were making a lot of profit, under the so-called war on drugs in the 80s and 90s, incarcerating people. I mean, as soon as 9/11 happened, DHS, ICE, the war on terror, those same people were just like, well, I guess immigrants are our next cash cow.
It's a profit.
Profit.
Yeah.
So
it's all for profit.
Yep.
So that's what brought you to that. And so then what was the arrangement like? Were you the first so-called or one of the first people in your region to do something like this? And did anyone else ever like follow and do similar types of, press type conferences?
Yeah, so I had this press conference in summer 2012. I was certainly the only person in the area for talking about Central New York, which is, separate than obviously all the activism that was happening in New York City, for example. but Syracuse is, about 5 hours, as you know, 5 hours away from New York City. So I was pretty isolated, and I did definitely, part of the rationale for me doing so was hoping we were in this moment where like all of these folks were coming out, and I was hoping that, other folks might come out. In fact, I haven't thought about it for a while, but I think I know of at least two other folks in that region who were in a very similar situation, and who I thought to myself, oh, maybe that's going to give them like space to do so. Unfortunately, it never did happen, but I want to be clear that I am incredibly happy I made that decision. It was not an easy decision. I was scared, but it's been this paradox, and we talked about it a little bit before this podcast, about how there has been this strange layer of protection once you're sort of out and public about being undocumented, as opposed to if you're isolated alone as an individual, you're just way easier to be picked off, and it helped me continue to understand the dynamics of this system, which is that this system absolutely thrives on people being isolated and away from community.
It's easy to disappear people in those instances because
Exactly.
nobody will know.
Exactly, 100%.
If Aly Wane gets picked up, a lot of people are going to know what's going on, and it's going to raise a lot more eyebrows, and maybe help you in the long run, and maybe get, some congressional reps or Senate, you know what I mean? Like, and that was kind of like, I remember back in that time frame, like leading up to DACA, there was so much push to publicize and get petitions out there. And a lot of it was through, again, like the Dream Activist Organization and Mohammed and Perna and those folks. um, they were really doing God's work in a sense by getting that information out there and saying, look, this person, Pedro, or, I had this client, Pedro, who was almost on his way out the door. And, but for the fact that they raised a lot of attention and got it out there, we were able to get at the time Representative Luis Gutierrez and others to contact ICE and say, hey, this is not somebody we should be deporting. And, obviously there's a lot of people who shouldn't be deported, but, you have to just keep fighting each battle one at a time. Right. And so your announcement, was it before DACA came out or after, or do you remember it all? Because DACA came out in June of that year.
I believe it was right after, because I think that my event, I don't know. I can't quite remember if it was, it was very close.
You were too old to be DACA eligible.
Yeah. I mean, it was frustrating. Like a lot of activists, I had been fighting to get us to DACA for a while.
And then you find out you're what, a year or two too old or something?
Yeah, I can't quite remember what the time frame was, but I was too old. I mean, I was still happy, even though like a lot of activists, and as you probably know, like a lot of us, even at the moment, were basically saying like, that's nice, it's a good start, but like unless we
got to expand
under there,
yeah.
Like, this could potentially be taken away. And unfortunately, fast forward to now, and it's like, it's where we're at.
I mean, it was a Band-Aid on the ultimate problem.
Yeah.
And it's always been, I think, one of the biggest, problems with our government is that they never seem to find a solid permanent solution. I mean, it's always these little Band-Aids, or instead of doing what I believe is, and this is my own core belief, a comprehensive immigration bill, they say, no, we'll do it in piecemeal fashion. And then when they do it in piecemeal fashion, which they are now, or which they have been doing, it's all right, let's just throw all the money at enforcement and screw everything else, that's the problem. Like, you're never going to have any sort of good positive change if you don't do it where it's a negotiation. And I get it. I mean, I think we both understand that you're never going to get everything you want. You may want an open system with no restrictions. We won't get that. It's just that it's not even practicable. But if we can get a few scraps along the way, I mean, at least give us something. And the worst part about DACA was that there were these age cutoffs. So people like you or Jose Antonio Vargas, you guys were too old. And that makes it even more ridiculous in that you guys, being even older, have probably been here longer than all these other folks.
Yeah. I mean, it was insane. Funny that you mentioned Jose. Like I've definitely had a lot of conversations with him, and I joked with him in the past that he was one of the most privileged undocumented people in the country because of his profile and everything. But I certainly don't want to minimize how hard it's been for him. And I'm thinking about
Puts a big target on his back too.
put a huge target on his back. And I've been actually thinking about him recently. I think he has been very brave over the years. And even with that quip of me like saying like, oh, you're so high profile, everyone like kind of loves you. Like even he, I think, just figured out some temporary legal process, but I think through some like extraordinary immigrant provision or something like that like most people would not have access to.
Well, then that raises the question, and I'm wondering, how many times have you been asked, why don't you just marry somebody?
Oh, yeah.
How many times? I want to know, is it 10, 30, 1,000?
A lot of times, and it's always, I mean, it's been a struggle, like figuring out how to have a regular like dating romantic life like while undocumented and everything, and even now it's something that I think about. Obviously not going to share who it is, but I am dating someone who's a US citizen, and as things are getting tougher, I am thinking about the practical piece around
Implications
implication of that. And I certainly don't. I'm still very much like, even after all of this time, like a kind of an old school romantic sense
traditional.
that like I just don't want to go through that process unless I really want to go through it,
You want it to be the right thing,
because I
man.
want it to be
I
the right
get it.
thing. But unfortunately, I mean, certainly as things get tougher and tougher, I'll have to think about it. And that's just to be clear, I really love the person I'm with right now, very happy. So like this is not like, oh, I'm not gonna like,
Yeah.
go through this
But we'll see
process.
where it
But
goes,
I
right?
just I just want it to be something where it's organic,
Yeah.
where we both are clear that that's what we want and it's real. And that's been one of the things that's the most frustrating about this system, for all of the talk about family values. I certainly have had friends who were immigrants and who, got married specifically for that practical reason. And that's just because there are no other pathways for a tremendous number of folks. So it's very frustrating how that intersects, with like your ability to have a partner and long-term kind of relationships. It's
It does add an interesting and difficult element to it too, because I think a lot of people walk into it thinking it's going to be an easy path. And the reality is, even getting married to a US citizen, you have to not only go through a pretty stringent vetting process about your relationship and the bona fides of that, but even if you get approved, in most cases you get this like temporary conditional green card, and then you have to 2 years later file again, and it's a whole process. So it is a commitment. Marriage is a commitment 100%. And some people don't even believe in the institution of marriage, but the system forces people to have to do it. And I'll get these like, 20, 21-year-old, kids coming with, their girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever. And they'll be like, hey, I want to get married and do the green card process. And I'll be like, all right, well, you got to understand, this is not a situation where you're just going to get married and you're just going to get a green card. This is a process, and I've seen cases where it just falls apart pretty quick. because they're not mature, they're not prepared for all the. I mean, it's a process that you have to be basically a full blown adult mentally to deal with. Who are, I would say, like, you know, your top like three um, top influences in your life? Who would you say are your top influences? And it could be anybody. Yeah.
Oh, I was not ready for that question. I probably have like way too many.
Well,
It'd be very hard to narrow it down. I mean,
today.
just from as an activist and an organizer, certainly
Yeah.
like the two people that immediately come to mind are Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And I think of them almost as like one unit. Like I feel like both of them were necessary in the fight for like Black liberation
In different
in
ways
different
because they
ways. Yeah.
had different methods and paths to doing what they did, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I have way too many. I mean,
You have a lot.
I will give you an example of someone who currently really inspires me and who I consider to be one of the best organizers in the country, and that's the abolitionist organizer Miriam Kaba. She gives me so much hope, and she's absolutely to me someone who is a little bit of a role model for how you do this organizing thing. And the reason I trust her so much and is because I've learned over the years that the organizers who are the best at doing what they do are organizers who produce other organizers. You know, they're not people who are simply like in the middle of the arena trying to gather all the attention, but they're actually producing other leaders and they're empowering other people. And in that sense, I think Miriam Kaba is like a perfect example of someone who does that really well. But genuinely, if I wanted to seriously think about who my influences are, we could be here for like an hour.
For another hour.
Like,
So let me then ask you, because I think we kind of skirted past this. What's your mom's name?
yeah, her name is Clementine. Clementine is the
Mhm.
and
And what was her back like to become a diplomat? That is not something that just gets handed to people. Like, it seems like she was a very strong person, right? A
yeah.
woman too, no less.
Yeah, I mean, mom was an extraordinary person. You know, she was only here for 50 years, but I tell people she packed so much in those 50 years. You know, she was the first person in her family to get a scholarship abroad in order to study. She was born in Mali, in Bamako, Mali, and by the time she got to university, she was able to get a scholarship to go study in France. And she had like all sorts of high profile jobs at in Senegal. And by the time she ended up with the United Nations, you know, she was already like kind of well known enough to be able to have that kind of diplomat's job. And the last few years of her life, she actually worked at the World Health Organization, you know, one of the institutions that's being cut off right now by our good friend Trump, right? But yeah, she was an extremely accomplished person, had an incredible love of life, and I think the thing that she certainly passed down to me and to my sister was both like a love of constant learning. She was always learning new things. I often tell people that my favorite gift that she got me was a gift that she gave herself on her 40th birthday. She just decided like to give herself flight lessons just because she just wanted to. And I remember being a kid and just being like, my mom is insane, but like I love it. Like I just
That's fearless. It's fearless,
yeah,
right?
she
Like,
just had this sense
yeah.
of like, if I want to try something, I'm gonna do it. But certainly the biggest thing that she gave my sister and me was this sense of like, we're not here for ourselves, you know, that the point of our lives, of our existences is not just to live for yourself, but to have a commitment to people, to the community, make sure that if you've gotten any advantage, you use that privilege in order to help people who have had less. And, you know, I do believe that both my sister and I, in our kind of different ways, have very much lived up to that, because we're both, very community minded folks. I mean, regardless of, I think, what my circumstances, would have turned out to be, I think I would have always done something that was connected to doing public community engagement work. It's just that I wasn't exactly given the choice.
I mean, you have the tools.
I do.
You just don't have the actual ability to go full blown into doing it because you're trapped in this situation, which actually, it raises another question, which is, you're very active, with social media and with your community organizing and all this stuff. I mean, do you have other I'm always curious, like what other activities do you like to do that where you just, I mean, do you ever just turn everything off and go and do, something for pleasure? And what is it that you like to do?
Oh my God, yeah. Like I tell people all the time, what I want to do is just chill out. Like I'm not that interested in doing all of this work. But I've developed, there are plenty of things I love to do. When I was in college, I was into both music and the arts, and I've done community theater in the intervening years. One of the things that I do almost every day in order to help with emotional processing is play the guitar. I just love playing music, love watching movies. That, by the way, that Nintendo Entertainment System thing really extended because I still play games. I'm still a gamer. Wow. After all of this time. I have a, PlayStation and everything.
Oh, so you've upgraded. You're not on the Nintendo. Okay.
Yeah, a slight upgrade. It's actually funny because now when I see folks who are like in their teens talking about like, oh my God, this game is crap. And I'm just like, oh my... You do realize that, like, I remember playing Pong, right? Like,
you were playing a game where it was just a dot, basically. That was it. And they're complaining about like 3D, AI stuff.
I know it's just kind of wild. But yeah, I mean, and if anything, as things have gotten harder, as certainly as they've gotten harder under Trump, I have made it a point to continue to figure out a way to maintain these mechanisms to just keep myself grounded, happy, joyful, regardless of what happens, because I know that politically things are only going to get tougher. But I have, I've tried to go pretty deep. I've both, done mental health counseling and also use meditation as a way to sort of just process things. And I do feel like I ground myself in something very deep, which is, and I've been checking in with myself recently. I do feel like at the base of what I do is a deep love of this world, of this life, of the community. That's at the base of everything. I think if that goes, then there's no point in doing any of this. But I do believe, regardless of all of the craziness that's coming out right now, I believe in us as a species and in us trying to continue to improve and to help each other out. And I do think that we're in this period right now where there's this battle between folks who love life and want to improve it for everyone and folks who are just blinkered by fear. In fact, you mentioned, influences. This is something I don't mention all that often publicly, but because of that Catholic worker training, one of my biggest role models, especially when I was younger, was this Catholic monk called Thomas Merton, who was just really great. He was both someone who thought a lot about, contemplative kind of prayer and mysticism, but who was also deeply political, who talked about the social justice issues of his time, all of the time. And he just had this way of linking like sort of personal well-being with like the community that I think to this day still inspires me. And sometimes in my meditation, I kind of call on his name and space as someone who really inspired me and gives me energy. And I do think of our lives as being these these kind of intergenerational chain links that we're trying to create, right? Because when I think of the organizing that I do and the work that I do, I'm like, oh, I have the ability to do that because of all of the work that people did before me. And when it's going to be my time to go, like I have full trust that, people are going to work on the issues that that I've worked on. So that keeps me from falling into a place of despair when, like, if a campaign doesn't work out or something like that. I try to remind myself this is bigger than just about campaigns. This is about creating a better world, and that's an intergenerational process
It's
necessary.
about setting the groundwork for the next generation, which is what
Mhm.
I think we all should be looking at right now, especially, during a time where there's such a divergence of views that are, it's a battle right now, and it will always be a battle, but it's a question of where will the next generation take us. And I think I have a couple more questions, but one is, and it kind of ties into that, do you do much of your own writing and in the realm of maybe, like, have you been working or do you plan to work on a memoir, a book about your life and your journey through this kind of crazy process?
I used to do more writing. I have actually reduced it, but ironically, these past couple months I've been really thinking about like starting to do that again. For the longest time my excuse was, I'm too busy doing activism to do any of these things, but now I do think that this Trump moment is this moment to reflect on all of the lessons learned, and also on this crazy life. I feel like I have just enough removed from all of those things to now be able to set them down on paper and have some kind of a deeper analysis about it. So I don't exactly know what the process is going to look like, but I am definitely much more in this conscious space of like wanting to write some of this stuff down because I do think there are lessons in there, and also just for myself, it would help me sort of contextualize all of these crazy things, especially since, and this is very much related to this topic and being undocumented and everything. One of the things that I've struggled with as someone who's undocumented, which is very common for a lot of folks who are undocumented, is there's no ground, to feel like you can just plan out like the next 5, 10, 15 years. So for a lot of my life, I really lived it as like, all right, let's just make it to the next month. Like that's really been a lot of my thinking. And it's only been recently that I've been thinking in terms of like, oh, I wonder, where I'm going to be in like 10, 15 years. Because I've spent so much of my time just surviving that the idea of like planning for something even a year out to me was just kind of like, oh, must be nice. In fact, I remember, um, NPR's show, This American Life, which is just great kind of storytelling podcast. They did have one episode that was focused on undocumented folks. I can't remember what the when exactly it happened, but I remember that the theme of the episode was limbo, and I was just like, they nailed it. That's exactly what it feels like to be undocumented. Is you're in this like existential limbo all of the time, where you feel like there's not enough of a ground so that you can establish roots, and so you have to navigate this like constantly being in between. And that's where things like, for example, meditation practice and everything like have helped me, because I'm like, I know I can't find stability in sort of my a lot of my material life, even with the improvements that I've made. I need to find some kind of grounding within myself so that I could keep doing this work. But I don't complain about it, because what's the point? But certainly it is exhausting to be undocumented in terms of the constant effort you have to make to remind yourself that you're
It's a
more than all
mental
of these
it's a
messages.
mental battle. Yeah.
This mental battle, you have to really find yourself, and that's where for me like the political organizing kind of doubled as both fighting for my rights, but also a way to really find myself, because when I first started doing this work, I was still one of those folks who believed like, well, like, I guess I'm illegal. This country has every right to kind of like tell me what they want to do with me. And as I did organizing of other folks who were undocumented, things really flipped for me internally, where I realized like, I'm already owed these human rights. So I am fighting for the rights that I'm already owed, which is a different framing than this kind of like, oh, I need to beg this country
Yeah.
to have
Ask
access.
for
And that's given me so much a sense of like confidence within my,
empowerment.
yeah,
It's an
empowerment.
empowerment. Yeah.
So again,
A lot of people, and I think this would be a good, kind of final question for you, because a lot of people have been asking me, and I think this is an important question to ask somebody who is actually undocumented, you know, who can answer it, in earnest. People who have not been involved in the immigrant rights battle, who have not been involved as much in civil rights, but are really being triggered by what's going on, keep asking me, what can we do to help as lay persons? Okay, let's just say people who are not lawyers, who may not be able to help on like mental health issues, stuff like that. What are some of the tips that you would provide to somebody who came up to you and said, Aly, I need I need to get involved. What can I do to get involved? What would you tell that person?
yeah, I mean, the answer obviously would differ based on if the person is a citizen with status or an immigrant.
Mm,
But certainly right now, I think that the power is at the grassroots. I think that the way you can exert your influence the most is at the grassroots. There are all sorts of rapid response teams and local immigration networks who have been doing this work for 10, 15, 20 years. Uh, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, like link up with those folks. In fact, right now, just this afternoon, I'm in touch with some of the folks out of Ithaca, because I don't know if how much you're aware of the fact that they're targeting this Cornell student who's been speaking out. He's going to have a court date here on Tuesday, and I'm sort of doing a little bit of coordinating with the rapid response teams in Ithaca. So I think that's really absolutely like where you want to focus on is grassroots rapid response work. Certainly, if there's any way to, if there are groups that you trust, obviously helping out with funding helps. And I do tend to emphasize like if you have connections with people who have direct connections with people being affected, I still say it's better to send them through those folks who can get that money directly to people. But if you can't, obviously there are lots of organizations that kind of help with that. If you are someone who just wants to do like research and everything, certainly there's so much free education happening right now in terms of, podcasts, Zooms, seminars on like what's going on in the immigration system. Because I do think that right now, especially, it's important to have context in terms of what's going on. Because for a lot of folks who are new to this, they look at what's happening with Trump and they're just like, oh, this just comes out of nowhere. And as you well know, we have been building to this for many, many years. And in order to do the political fight, you do have to have some level of a context, I think, for that. And then of course I think citizenship privilege, if you're a citizen right now, like it could not be more important right now if you're serious to find ways to use that privilege to show up to your neighbors places if they're about to be sort of deported. For example, one of the things that I'm thinking of right now, once again, with this Cornell student who's going to have this court case on Tuesday, is figuring out a way to, to pack the court. And certainly I will tell like people, if you're a citizen, absolutely go in there. If you're a non-citizen, just stay outside. This is where like, I think in moments like this, and I say this as someone who has been part of a movement of people who are undocumented and who've taken so many risks over the years. I think it's really, if U.S. citizens are serious about wanting to change the system, it's time for them to start considering putting their bodies on the line. It doesn't have to be dramatic. But even something as small as being able to be there and witness as someone is taken away, as you know, as a lawyer, like that makes a difference, that they know that whoever is being incarcerated or there's a deportation proceeding, they know that there are community members who are paying attention
and document that,
and
and make sure you memorialize it, record it, whatever. I mean, this is, again, go back to my family's history. We're looking at very similar types of scenarios that were akin to Nazi Germany, but today we all have recording devices. We can use our voices. We can step up and be bold and fearless, which is what you have you have every reason to live in fear and live in the shadows, but you represent what's right about our world, which is that you can step out of your own comfort zone and not live in a total state of fear. So I just want to say thank you.
No, thank you. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you, finally to connect with you after all of this time, sort of in person. I can't say enough how much I respect immigration lawyer allies, especially in this moment. It's always been one of those jobs where I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't think I would ever want to be an immigration lawyer. It seems like it's exhausting enough with my level of understanding of the complexity of the system to think about it. It's a lot of work. So I really appreciate that. And one of the things that I also appreciate specifically is you thinking about your own heritage and as it relates to this work. It is probably not a coincidence that I myself also have a lot of Jewish friends who are allies in this space and who use that kind of their own ancestral experience, to inform the fact, like they know what's going on. And even recently, I know there's been a lot of tension around Palestine and Israel, but you're seeing increasingly a number of like Jewish individuals coming out and saying like all of this stuff that the Trump administration is saying about like, oh, they're going after anti-Semitism. We know what that looks like, and we know that they're going to use that to go after us Jews as well.
It's an excuse. It
It's
really is.
total
I mean,
excuse. Yeah.
and there's a lot of conflating and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
so yeah. Anyway, lots of
Well, Aly Wane, human rights organizer, someone who I've grown to appreciate, significantly. Again, thanks to our, introduction over a decade ago through social media. Finally, get to meet face to face, and hopefully not for the last time. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And again, the podcast is Immigration Ain't Easy. And I want to thank Emma Goldman, not the anarchist, but my own personal anarchist in my house. Emma Goldman is my daughter, and she produces and does the editing. And so give her a shout out. And again, thank you so much.
Of course, really glad to be on here.